the government of Palestine, although it has a lot of international recognition, is much less organized and unitary than the government of Republic of China on Taiwan. There's only one government on the Republic of China on Taiwan, and it governs all of the territories under its jurisdiction. Whereas there's Palestine has a government on the West Bank, but they also have a separate government in what they call the Gaza Strip, and those governments don't work together. They don't even really they don't formally recognize each other. So there's kind of a civil war going on within the Palestinian Authority, and that authority itself has uncertain legal status and isn't in full control of most of the land that it claims to control. That's why it refers to itself as occupied. Originally, there was a UN resolution which was going to divide up the former British colony, but there's no agreement on where the territorial lines would be. And there wasn't any agreement on how that would be divided. And then there's a war, which just jumbled it further. And the control of the territory, even if the legal claims are different, the control of territory has really varied over the time, whereas it's been relatively static on the Taiwan-China scenario.
Peaceful maintenance of what we call the status quo in the China-Taiwan dispute is distinctly different to the multiple wars and conflicts in the Middle East. But right now Taiwan is under threat of a possible Chinese invasion. So obviously religion is a key point of conflict in the Middle East. For Taiwan, is it the difference between democracy and autocracy?
I think religion is probably the biggest difference. What makes Israel-Palestine issue even more difficult to resolve is that the religious claims to Jerusalem has a religious significance for the three great major religions of the world: Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. This city, there are places within that city that have massively important religious significance. And so therefore, that's one of the reasons why sharing control or allocating control over Jerusalem is even more difficult than allocating control over any part of Taiwan or China, because there's a religious significance that people all around the world who are not Palestinian or Israeli care much about Jerusalem and how it's allocated and controlled. So religion is a big issue. So there's a lot more sort of in common between Chinese and Taiwanese than there would be between Israelis and Palestinians. I think the difference today, I think, is that there is a Taiwanese identity that's evolved over the last 70 years, and before that even, because it was under Japanese colonization. There is a really distinct political culture in Taiwan, and that makes a difference. I think there's the fact that they have a really different political ideology, different political system, is a dramatic difference and makes it very hard to resolve any sort of the dispute between China and Taiwan. Palestine and Taiwan parallel is that they're really the opposite scenario. So Palestine is recognized by many, many countries around the world as a country and a state, even though it doesn't, as I said, it doesn't really control its own territory that it claims. It has very little control over the territory that Israel allows it to control, and it doesn't control the rest of the territory it claims. So it's a very weak state that has no effective control. It doesn't really meet most international law definitions of a state. Taiwan is the opposite. Taiwan is a country, has a government, and which is a very stable government, a stable state, has control of all the territory that it essentially claims to control, and has almost no, as we've seen, very little international recognition as a state at all. And that difference is a good example of why statehood is not really a legal concept, it's a political concept. There's just a lot more political support for Palestine, I suppose, than there is for Taiwan, and it has to do, I think, with the influence of China in preventing other countries from recognizing Taiwan.
As you just said, it's the power of China or the influence of China that's kept the international community kind of out of the Taiwan-China conflict.
Yeah, so the UN has been all over the Israel-Palestine conflict, and that conflict has been internationalized from the outset. It's always been considered within the mandate of the UN. And the UN has many bureaucracies and many institutions that are involved. And I don't know if the Israelis would say they tend to favor Palestine, and that might be true in many cases. But in any event, Israel is actually the member of the UN, but the UN has many institutions that are working on behalf of Palestine, and Palestine's an observer state of the UN. So, whereas in the China context, the UN basically favors China. It's effectively taken China's side on all issues with respect to Taiwan. It's kept Taiwan from getting any membership. It's also shut Taiwan out of any international organizations that are related to the UN.
Is there again another parallel with Taiwan, China, whereby the US essentially enabled, the Chinese nationalists in the Chinese Civil War to decamp to Taiwan? Parallel between the UN's role in the Israel-Palestine conflict and the US's role in the Taiwan-China dispute.
The US created the problem. But it is certainly the U.S. intervention is why there is still a separate government on Taiwan. I think if the U.S. had not intervened, then it's quite possible that the PRC government would have been able to successfully take Taiwan. So, to the extent they've created a mess, I suppose, but they've also created and enabled Taiwan to exist. Israel and Taiwan, I think, are more analogous to the way that they're kind of anomalies where they are, and they're threatened by their neighbors historically. And U.S. support has enabled both of those countries to stay independent, or at least autonomous in Taiwan's case. And so I think in a weird way, they kind of Israel is more like Taiwan than it is like Palestine. But you could flip the analogy the other way, of course, which is Palestine is being threatened by Israel, or is being occupied by Israel or affected by Israel, and the Arab states are trying to protect Palestine from them. But I think that story is not doesn't fully capture the situation where Israel is a very small country. It's not like China. It's not a superpower. It doesn't really have any. It has a smaller population than all of the countries around it. So really, it's more like it's only got 5 million people, really, surrounded by 5 countries around it that have millions more. The difference, though, is that Taiwan has never really felt the same kind of urgency that Israel does in terms of military readiness.
Do you think that feeling could change if military action actually did manifest?
They're really in a position to do what Israel's done and make itself so militarily strong that it would be very painful for other countries to try to invade and occupy it. And I just don't feel like the Taiwanese have the same urgency, at least when I've been in Taiwan. But that could change. I know that's changing a little bit. And maybe that'll change more. There's 20 million Taiwanese, more than that. There's no more than 5 million or 6 million Israelis. So Israelis feel like there just aren't that many of them. If they don't stick together, they'll be wiped out.